I'm going to have to remember that children's sermon. Everybody was pretty subdued. It was kind of nice. So, we've been talking about the Psalms. I always like the line in the Psalms, make a joyful noise to the Lord, all ye lands. I like that because I was pretty convinced as a kid that was written for our family. You know, make a joyful noise to the Lord, all ye lands. That comes from Psalm 100. Psalm 100 is a psalm of praise, a psalm of celebration, a psalm of thanksgiving. Psalm 40 is much like that. Psalm 40 wasn't written for my family, but it is a psalm of celebration, psalm of thanksgiving, a psalm of praise. It was a psalm written for all families, not just mine. It was written for all families and all people so that they had an opportunity, a chance to give voice, to give praise in song in the ancient hymnal, to give praise to God. Now recently, well, it depends on how you describe recently, but recently this was made into a song by U2. It's been quite a few years, but still U2 made it into a song. It's called 40. And this is a song sung by U2 that begins with the very first words of Psalm 40, I waited patiently for the Lord. Then it goes on and it builds until it gets to the place where Bono sings, I will sing a new song. Now, I don't know, do we have any U2 fans here? 1, 2, 3, 4? Yeah. Everybody loves U2. You should. Carolitha does. Carolitha loves them. Everybody ought to love them. That's not true. Everybody should love U2 anyway. But if you get a chance, it's kind of fun to go online. You can go and you can look at videos of these concerts that U2 does. And generally, when they're wrapping up these concerts, they're in these venues with thousands and thousands of people from all over the world, and they are in all places in the world. And it comes to the end of the concert, and Bono gets on stage, and he starts to sing this song, I will wait patiently for the Lord. And as he begins, suddenly something happens. All these thousands and thousands of people that are there in that concert start to sing along with him. Now, I don't know how many of the people who are there in those concerts know the inspiration for that song 40. Maybe just a few of them, maybe all of them, I don't know. But they're all singing the words. They are all lifting up their voices together in unison songs of praise to God. And that's pretty spectacular. And I think that's kind of the intent of what this psalm is about. Encouraging people to come together and to lift up their voices in praise to God. A couple weeks ago, I shared with y'all some personal information. I shared with you that I like beer. I also happen to like live music. I'm a big fan of live music. And one of my favorite bands is a band called the Avett Brothers. And I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to get to go see the Avett Brothers in concert at an outdoor venue in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Now, the Avett Brothers, if you're not aware, they might kind of be considered like modern Americana music. They started off in the punk rock scene, and somehow or another, they slowly moved or morphed or migrated into American folk music, oddly enough. It's kind of this typical Americana type sound. Well, anyway, after the concert, I read a review of the concert that someone had written, and it was described as a bunch of plaid-wearing hipsters. Now, I was wearing plaid that day, but I don't really think anybody would describe me as hipster, so I guess they didn't see me at the concert. But anyway, it was just this amazing, beautiful concert. And then at the end of the concert, when it was over, when everyone's cheering, waiting for them to come back on stage for an encore performance, suddenly they do come back on stage. And I don't know if y'all have ever been to a concert before of a band that you really like, but you're always hoping that in the encore, they're going to sing that one song that is your favorite song that they hadn't sung during the concert, right? That's always what you're hoping for. And you could tell everyone there was just waiting for that one song. And then these two brothers started to sing Just a Closer Walk with Thee. And everyone at first was really excited. And then you could kind of feel this tension in the crowd. And everyone got really quiet. And then suddenly one of the brothers stopped in mid-song and says, It don't matter what you believe. If you want to sing, just sing. And then everyone started to sing along. Just a closer walk with thee. It was like we were at some old revival. It was amazing. It was an absolutely beautiful moment of people lifting up their voices together in songs of thanksgiving and praise of God. That's what Psalm 40 is. It is a psalm of thanksgiving. Now, if you remember a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the Psalms, we talked about how there are so many Psalms that we've had to break them into categories, right? Because it's easier to digest them when we put them into categories like Pringles and all the different flavors. Do y'all remember any of this? Okay, just making sure. I've been gone a week. I just want to make sure y'all been keeping up with things. And so we've talked about how there have been psalms of wisdom psalms. We have talked about psalms of lament. And this is a psalm called a psalm of thanksgiving or a song of praise or of celebration. Now, each one of these categories, whether it's a wisdom, lament, or thanksgiving, or one of the many others, has certain characteristics that it has to follow to fit into that category. This is a psalm of thanksgiving. And even though we only got 10 verses of Psalm 40, in those 10 verses, we get the attributes of thanksgiving, the attributes of celebration, the attributes of praise that you get in your typical psalm of thanksgiving, celebration, or praise. Every psalm of thanksgiving or praise begins with a moment of crisis. There is some sort of crisis. There is some sort of almost catastrophe of which the psalmist needs to be saved. And from that crisis, from that catastrophe, the psalmist is saved. The psalmist here in Psalm 40 talks about being down in the desolate pit, being stuck in the miry bog. And they cried out to God. God heard their voice and rescued them. God lifted them from the pit. And for that act of lifting from the pit, that is for what we give thanks. That is why the psalmist gives thanks, because God lifted them from the pit. Not only did God lift them from the pit, rescue them from the quagmire, but God gave voice. God gave voice to their concerns. God heard their concerns. And for all of these reasons, the psalmist thanks God. And there's a particular way, if you noticed in the reading, that the psalmist thanks God. The psalmist doesn't just say, "Thank you, Lord," and call it quits. There's much more to it than that. The psalmist is so full with gratitude and thanksgiving for what God has done that the thanks and praise overflow from the psalmist. Now, obviously, that's not the case in the story of the gospel with Jesus and the lepers. Only one of them gives the appropriate response of thanks for being rescued, for being provided salvation. But here the psalmist thinks everyone ought to do that. When God rescues you, when God saves you, when God changes the condition of your life, what choice do we have but to bubble forth in praise and thanksgiving? The psalmist says, "I have not kept quiet in front of the great congregation. I will not harbor these things in my heart. I will give praise with my lips to you, O Lord my God." The psalmist tells of great tidings, the good things, the great and marvelous, wonderful deeds that God has done, and is not ashamed to do that before everyone. That is a psalm of thanksgiving. And that is what Psalm 40 is. You may also remember a few weeks ago we talked about Walter Brueggemann. Walter Brueggemann is a theologian. He wrote a book called Praying the Psalms. And in that book, he suggests that our life with God, our journey with God, follows a certain pattern. And it is that certain pattern that we can also see reflected in the Psalms. Brueggemann says that we begin in a place of secure orientation. We then move to a place of disorientation, and then to a surprising moment of reorientation. Brueggemann says that secure orientation is where everything is in balance in our lives. When God is in the heaven and all is right with the world and there are no problems. Everything is perfect. And that secure orientation, that moment of pristine equilibrium, that is what we all desire, what we all yearn for. But, unfortunately, kind of boring. There's not a lot of excitement there in that place. And so we rarely stay in that moment of pristine equilibrium and orientation. So then we move to a place of disorientation, when things get wonky, as Richard likes to say with many of the hymns that I pick out. It sounds a little wonky. Let's do something else. Disorientation says things get a little wonky. But it is in those wonky moments when things are almost at their worst, it is in those moments that we are most vulnerable to God. It is in those moments that we can be most aware of God. It is in those moments that we cry out to God. And then we wait. The psalmist says, I waited patiently for the Lord, or I waited and I waited for the Lord. Waiting for that moment of reorientation. But let's be clear, the waiting here that the psalmist is talking about, it's not like the waiting that you do in the dentist office. You know, it's not like just sitting there and flipping through back issues of Sports Illustrated or People magazine and mumbling all the time about, I can't believe it booked so many people and they're running so late and blah, blah, blah. It's not that kind of waiting. It is hopeful waiting. It is hopeful anticipation, anxious anticipation. It is looking forward to whatever it might be that God is going to do in your lives. It is the waiting that you do when you are holding your breath for the first time, watching that child and trying to see if they're going to be able to take that step all on their own or not. It is waiting and waiting, hopeful anticipation. It is that moment when you ask someone out on that first date. And yeah, you've made a connection, and you hope they're going to say yes, but you just don't know quite what it's going to be just yet. I waited and waited for the Lord. I couldn't wait to see what God was going to do next in my life. God reorients our life. Whatever happened before we went down to the pit was gone and was never going to return. God reorients us to a new place in our life. That is where we go. That is where the psalmist takes us, to a place of reorientation, as Brueggemann might call it. When the psalmist talks about this thanksgiving, I couldn't help but think that the thanksgiving of looking for this place of reorientation, giving thanks for what God has done, it's not just about saying thank you. It really sounds like evangelism to me. The psalmist gives praise to God before anyone who will listen for what God has done. Now, this isn't typically how we look at evangelism. Generally speaking, we look at evangelism as going and convincing people to come to church or to save their souls, right? Generally, Presbyterians are more focused on the, hey, come to our church thing, rather than our evangelical brothers and sisters who are more concerned about praying the prayer of salvation. But I think people are getting weary and wary of this kind of evangelism. When people find out that I'm a minister, the first thing they do is they tell me where they go to church or with what faith they are affiliated. It's like they want to stop me before I get a chance to invite them to our church. Like, no, don't worry. I'm good. I got church covered. I mean, can you blame people for being weary and wary of most evangelism that says, hey, let me tell you why you need to come to my church. Or, hey, let me tell you why you need to find Jesus. I mean, how do you feel when that doorbell rings and you know it's the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormon missionary kids? People are weary and wary of the evangelism that has an angle, of the evangelism that's trying to accomplish something, either to save more souls or to get more people in the pews. There's a really great, funny cartoon on YouTube, but I got to warn you, before we go any further, I won't say any of the words, but if you go looking for it, there's some foul language in the cartoon on YouTube. It's about Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. It's about what happens when Wile E. Coyote finally catches the Roadrunner. He finally catches the Roadrunner, and he invites one of his coyote friends over for dinner, because they're eating the Roadrunner, of course. And he's talking about how good it is. Like, oh, you know, when you've worked so hard for something and you've done it all yourself, it's like, oh, it just tastes so much better. And his friend Coyote says to Wiley, so have you thought about what you're going to do now with your life? I don't know. I've been chasing this bird for 20 years. In the next few scenes, Wiley starts going into a downward spiral of depression, not knowing what he's supposed to do with his life. He tries waiting tables, that didn't work out. All kinds of things. And finally he gets to the place where he just can't take it anymore. He has no direction in his life, and he's about to end it all. And moments before he ends his life, he has this look on his face, like he found this moment of clarity. And the next scene, he's there in the coffee shop with his friend, the other coyote, and he goes, and that's when I realized it. That's when I found a new purpose and direction for my life. And his friend says, oh, that's great. That's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. And Wiley says, and so I'm wondering if you had about 45 minutes, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Jesus Christ. And the other coyote goes, oh, no. But of course he says different words because it's not good words. People have grown wary of us when we try to convince them about why they need Jesus or about why they need to come to church. The psalmist doesn't do that. The psalmist in evangelism just gives praise to God, tells other people about how great and good God is and what God has done for them. Maybe that's what evangelism ought to be about us singing the praises of God and hoping that other people will want to sing along. Amen.